It is not losing you specifically that terrifies them the most. I know how that sounds, especially if you have spent considerable time believing the opposite, believing that your absence alone should be devastating enough to explain whatever internal turmoil your silence eventually produces. But there is something underneath that loss, something considerably deeper, something they have spent their entire life quietly avoiding without ever fully naming it. Today, we are going to name it clearly, because understanding this one specific fear changes everything about how you interpret their behavior once your contact genuinely stops. Let's begin by ruling out the explanation most people assume first, that losing access to you specifically represents the core fear driving their internal disruption once contact stops. While your absence certainly registers as significant, attachment psychology reveals something more precise happening beneath that surface level loss. The deepest fear activated by genuine, sustained silence is not about you leaving. It is about what your leaving seems to confirm, a belief they have carried, often since early childhood, that they are fundamentally too difficult to love consistently, fundamentally destined toward eventual abandonment, regardless of how hard anyone tries to remain close to them. Let's talk about where this belief originates, because tracing its roots explains why it holds such disproportionate power over someone's internal experience. Avoidant patterns typically develop through early experiences, where closeness felt unreliable, where caregivers were inconsistently available, emotionally distant, or unpredictable in their affection. A child navigating this kind of environment does not conclude that the caregiver simply struggled with their own limitations. Children, developmentally, tend to internalize relational failure as personal failure, concluding instead that something about themselves specifically caused the inconsistency they experienced. This conclusion, formed long before conscious reasoning could challenge it, becomes a foundational belief that persists quietly into adulthood, shaping every subsequent close relationship without ever being fully or consciously examined. Let's talk about how this belief typically gets managed throughout adult relationships, because understanding the management strategy clarifies why avoidant withdrawal makes considerably more sense once viewed through this lens. If the core belief insists that closeness eventually leads to abandonment, then creating distance preemptively offers a strange, protective logic, controlling the timing and the terms of separation, rather than passively waiting for someone else to eventually confirm the belief through their own departure. This is why avoidant individuals so often withdraw specifically as closeness deepens, not because they want distance, but because distance feels safer than remaining vulnerable to a rejection they have already convinced themselves is inevitable. Let's talk about what happens specifically when you stop contacting them, because this moment disrupts the entire protective strategy just described in a particularly significant way. As long as you remained the one pursuing, the one reaching out despite their inconsistency, their core belief remained comfortably unconfirmed, since your continued efforts suggested, at least implicitly, that perhaps they were not quite as unlovable as their deepest fear insisted. Your silence removes this implicit reassurance entirely. It does not simply represent losing your presence. It represents losing the ongoing evidence that had been quietly contradicting their oldest, most painful belief about themselves. Let's talk about why this particular disruption produces such intense internal reaction, often considerably more intense than losing access to any other person in their life typically would. When your silence arrives, their mind does not simply register absence. It often registers something closer to confirmation, a felt sense that the fear they have carried since childhood has finally, definitively been proven true. This is not a rational conclusion, and if directly confronted, they would likely resist and deny reaching it consciously. But the emotional, physiological experience frequently operates according to this exact logic, regardless of what conscious reasoning might insist instead. Let's talk about what specifically makes silence considerably more threatening to this fear than an angry confrontation or an emotional argument would be. Conflict, however uncomfortable, still involves engagement, still involves you directing energy and attention toward them, still implicitly suggests the relationship matters enough to fight about. Genuine silence removes this engagement entirely, offering nothing to interpret except absence itself. And absence, to a mind already primed toward believing in its own fundamental unlovability, tends to fill that empty space with exactly the worst possible interpretation available. Let's talk about how this fear manifests behaviorally once it has been triggered by sustained silence, because the resulting behavior often looks considerably different depending on how directly someone has processed this underlying fear throughout their own life. Some individuals respond with increased, sometimes surprising vulnerability, reaching out with unusual openness, acknowledging patterns they previously denied, driven by genuine panic that the core fear has finally been confirmed, and desperate hope that reaching out might somehow interrupt that confirmation before it becomes permanent. Others respond with the opposite pattern, doubling down on distance, protecting themselves from further confirmation by avoiding any interaction that might reveal additional evidence supporting the fear they are desperately trying not to fully face. Let's talk about what distinguishes these two responses, because understanding the difference offers valuable insight into how deeply someone has already confronted or avoided their own underlying attachment wounds. Increased vulnerability tends to emerge from people who possess at least some conscious access to their own internal experience, even if that access remains imperfect or incomplete. Increased withdrawal tends to emerge from people whose defenses remain considerably more rigid, protecting them so thoroughly from conscious awareness of this core fear that even its activation gets managed entirely through further avoidance, rather than through any direct engagement with what is actually happening internally. Let's talk about what this understanding should specifically change about how you interpret their eventual reaction to your continued silence, whichever form that reaction ultimately takes. If they reach out with genuine vulnerability, this vulnerability reflects real internal disruption worth taking seriously, though it still requires the same careful, measured evaluation discussed throughout other conversations regarding genuine change versus temporary reaction to crisis. If they retreat further into silence themselves, this retreat does not necessarily indicate indifference toward losing you. It may reflect the opposite, a fear so significant that further avoidance became the only available coping mechanism capable of managing it. Let's talk about why this understanding matters so significantly for your own emotional experience throughout this process, because it fundamentally reframes what their silence in return actually means. Continued silence on their end, following your own withdrawal, does not necessarily confirm that they never cared, or that your absence produced no genuine internal effect. It may instead reflect the depth of the very fear this entire discussion has been describing, a fear so threatening that even acknowledging its activation feels impossible, let alone reaching out in a way that would require confronting it directly. Let's talk about the specific danger of using this understanding to justify indefinite continued waiting, because compassionate understanding of their internal experience does not obligate you to remain suspended indefinitely, hoping that sufficient time will eventually produce the vulnerable engagement their core fear currently prevents. Understanding the mechanism behind their behavior serves your own healing and your own accurate perception. It does not change what you genuinely require from a sustainable, healthy partnership, nor does it obligate you to continue extending patience without any corresponding evidence that genuine internal work is actually occurring on their end. Let's talk about what genuine healing from this particular fear would actually require, healing worth understanding clearly, even though facilitating it was never your responsibility to provide. Genuine healing requires developing conscious awareness of the underlying belief itself, recognizing consciously that early experiences shaped a conclusion about their own lovability that does not accurately reflect present reality. It requires tolerating the anxiety this awareness produces without immediately retreating into familiar avoidance. It often requires professional support, given how deeply rooted this particular belief typically proves to be. Support capable of helping someone gradually build a more accurate, more compassionate understanding of their own worth, independent of any single relationship's outcome. Let's talk about what remains true regardless of whether this healing ever occurs on their end, because your own well being cannot remain contingent on their internal process, however genuinely you might understand and even feel compassion for what drives it. You are not responsible for confirming or disconfirming someone else's deepest fear about their own lovability. That responsibility and that healing belongs entirely to them, requiring their own genuine willingness and their own genuine effort, neither of which your continued presence or continued absence can force into existence on their behalf. Let's talk about what this entire understanding offers you specifically, beyond simply satisfying curiosity about their internal experience. It offers considerable relief from any residual belief that your silence represents cruelty or excessive harshness, replacing that belief with accurate understanding that your own healthy boundary, however difficult for them to receive, reflects reasonable self-protection rather than any genuine wrongdoing on your part. It offers protection against interpreting whatever reaction eventually follows your silence, whether increased vulnerability or increased withdrawal, as either complete validation or complete rejection, recognizing instead that both responses likely stem from the same underlying fear, operating through different defensive strategies. Let's talk about what it means to hold genuine compassion for this fear, while still maintaining complete clarity regarding your own needs and your own boundaries throughout this process. Compassion here does not require reopening contact prematurely, does not require softening consequences that your own well-being genuinely requires, does not require indefinite patience extended without corresponding evidence of change. It simply means understanding, with genuine clarity rather than continued confusion, exactly what likely drives their behavior. Understanding that ultimately serves your own peace considerably more than it serves any obligation toward continuing to manage or soothe their unresolved fear on their behalf. Let's talk about a specific psychological concept worth understanding more fully here, something researchers sometimes call the internal working model, a kind of unconscious template built during childhood that shapes expectations about how relationships generally function throughout the rest of a person's life. This template, once formed, operates almost like a filter, coloring how ambiguous situations get interpreted long before conscious reasoning has a chance to evaluate them more objectively. For someone whose internal working model includes deep uncertainty about their own lovability, your silence does not pass through neutral filtering. It gets processed immediately through this pre-existing template, interpreted automatically as confirmation of something already quietly, painfully believed, rather than as simply one person's reasonable response to considerable relational difficulty. Let's talk about why this automatic interpretation happens so quickly, often before any conscious, reasoned analysis has the opportunity to intervene. Templates formed during early childhood operate considerably faster than deliberate, conscious thought, activating almost instantaneously in response to triggering circumstances. This means the fear being described throughout this discussion often surfaces as an immediate, visceral reaction, rather than as a slow, considered conclusion, explaining why the intensity of response to genuine silence frequently seems disproportionate to what conscious, rational thought alone would predict. Let's talk about what specifically makes silence uniquely powerful in triggering this particular template. More powerful, often, than even explicit rejection or explicit criticism might prove to be. Explicit rejection, however painful, at least provides concrete information, something specific to respond to, something specific that could theoretically be addressed or explained. Silence provides nothing concrete at all, leaving the mind entirely free to fill that emptiness with whatever interpretation the underlying template most readily supplies. For someone whose template already leans heavily toward believing in their own fundamental unlovability, this empty space becomes almost inevitably filled with exactly that conclusion, regardless of how inaccurate it may actually be. Let's talk about the specific role shame plays throughout this entire internal process. Shame, considerably more corrosive and more difficult to access consciously than ordinary sadness or ordinary disappointment might be. Shame, unlike sadness, does not simply say something painful happened. It says something is fundamentally wrong with the self, a considerably more threatening, more destabilizing message that the mind often works actively to avoid feeling directly. This avoidance explains why so much of this internal process remains unconscious, operating beneath awareness, precisely because full conscious access to this particular shame would prove considerably more overwhelming than simply managing its effects through avoidance and withdrawal instead. Let's talk about what happens specifically when this shame briefly surfaces into partial conscious awareness, even without full acknowledgement, because this partial surfacing often explains certain confusing behaviors that might otherwise seem contradictory or difficult to interpret. Someone might experience a sudden urge to reach out, followed immediately by intense resistance to actually doing so, a push and pull that reflects genuine internal conflict between the urge toward reconnection and the deeper fear that reconnection might simply provide additional opportunity for the core fear to eventually be confirmed once again. This internal conflict can produce considerable behavioral inconsistency, starting to type a message and then deleting it, picking up a phone and then setting it back down. Patterns that reflect genuine internal struggle rather than simple indifference or simple lack of care. Let's talk about what specific evidence over time would suggest that someone is genuinely beginning to confront this underlying fear, rather than continuing to manage it purely through avoidance. Genuine confrontation typically involves increasing willingness to discuss vulnerability directly, sometimes including direct acknowledgement of fear itself. Statements that name the underlying anxiety, rather than simply displaying its behavioral symptoms without ever addressing its actual source. It involves increasing tolerance for uncertainty without immediate need for reassurance. Evidence that the internal working model is gradually beginning to shift toward greater trust, rather than remaining rigidly fixed in its original, more fearful configuration. Let's talk about what it means for your own emotional processing to hold this deeper understanding alongside your own genuine grief and your own genuine frustration regarding everything this relationship has required you to navigate. Understanding the psychological mechanism behind their behavior does not require you to abandon your own difficult feelings about how that behavior affected you personally. You are allowed to hold considerable compassion for the origin of their fear, while simultaneously feeling genuine frustration, genuine exhaustion, and genuine grief regarding how significantly that fear ultimately shaped your own experience within this relationship. Let's talk about what genuine self-protection looks like once you have developed this deeper understanding. Self-protection that does not require becoming cold or dismissive toward their genuine internal struggle, but that does require maintaining firm boundaries around how much of your own life and your own well-being remains available for continued navigation of a pattern that ultimately requires their own internal work, rather than your continued patient management. This balance, compassionate understanding paired with firm self-protection, represents considerably more sophisticated emotional navigation than either extreme, either complete dismissal of their internal experience or complete self-sacrifice in continued service of managing it. Let's talk about the specific way this fear tends to interact with any new romantic interest that might enter their life during this same period of processing your absence, because this particular complication deserves honest examination. Sometimes new romantic attention becomes a way of quickly disproving the very fear your silence activated, seeking rapid external validation that they remain lovable despite what your absence seemed to suggest. This pursuit of quick validation rarely resolves the underlying fear in any lasting way, since the fear itself lives considerably deeper than any single relationship's presence or absence could genuinely address, meaning this pattern often simply relocates the same underlying dynamic into a new context rather than actually working through what originally caused it. Let's talk about what this means for you specifically, should you ever learn that new romantic interest emerged relatively quickly following your own withdrawal. This information, while understandably painful to receive, does not necessarily indicate that your absence produced no genuine internal effect, nor does it necessarily indicate they never cared about you as deeply as you once believed. It may simply reflect the same underlying fear seeking whatever available relief it can find, relief that, without genuine internal work addressing its actual source, rarely provides the lasting resolution it appears to offer on the surface. Let's talk about what specific patience this entire understanding requires from you. Patience considerably different from waiting anxiously for them to eventually confront this fear and return with genuine, transformed capacity for closeness. This patience involves simply continuing your own healing, your own life, entirely independent of whatever internal process continues unfolding on their end, trusting that your own path forward does not require their resolution in order to proceed fully and completely. Let's talk about what remains available to you specifically once you have fully absorbed this deeper understanding of avoidant psychology, understanding that extends well beyond simply this particular relationship into how you might interpret similar dynamics in any future connection involving comparable patterns. You now understand that silence, when it triggers withdrawal or apparent indifference rather than reconnection, likely reflects genuine internal fear rather than genuine lack of care, protecting you from the harsh, inaccurate conclusion that their eventual silence in return proves your own unworthiness of pursuit or genuine attachment. Let's talk about the specific danger, worth naming one final time, of allowing this compassionate understanding to translate into excessive responsibility for managing or resolving their fear on their behalf. Understanding a psychological mechanism does not obligate anyone to become its therapist, its caretaker, or its permanent solution. Their fear, however genuinely activated by your absence, belongs entirely to them to eventually address, through whatever combination of self-reflection, professional support, or accumulated life experience eventually proves capable of shifting a template formed considerably before you ever entered their story. Let's talk about what genuine hope looks like throughout this entire process. Hope that remains realistic rather than becoming another form of anxious waiting disguised as understanding. Genuine hope acknowledges that people can and do heal from these deeply rooted fears, given sufficient genuine effort and sufficient time, while simultaneously accepting that this healing, if it occurs at all, may happen entirely outside your continued presence or continued awareness, within their own life, their own timeline, potentially within an entirely different relationship than the one you shared together. Let's talk, finally, about what this understanding offers your own capacity for future connection, protection considerably more valuable than simply satisfying curiosity about what happened within this particular relationship. Recognizing this fear clearly, understanding its origins and its typical behavioral expressions, equips you to recognize similar patterns considerably earlier within future relationships, protecting your own heart from investing indefinitely in dynamics driven by fears that ultimately require the other person's own internal work rather than your continued patient presence in order to genuinely resolve. Let's talk about what it means to sit with the discomfort of never fully knowing exactly what internal process unfolds on their side of this silence. Discomfort that deserves acknowledgement, rather than being resolved through continued speculation or continued attempts to gather information through indirect channels. Genuine peace throughout this process rarely comes from finally obtaining complete certainty about their internal experience. It comes instead from making peace with genuine uncertainty, trusting the psychological understanding this discussion has offered without requiring direct confirmation that it accurately describes their specific individual experience in every detail. Let's talk about the specific value of redirecting the considerable mental energy this kind of speculation typically consumes toward your own continued healing and your own continued life instead. Every hour spent wondering about their internal fear, their internal process, their eventual reaction, represents an hour not spent investing in your own well-being, your own goals, your own healing journey that continues regardless of whatever remains permanently unknown about what unfolds on the other side of your maintained silence. Let's talk about what genuine closure actually means once this understanding has been fully absorbed. Closure that does not require them ever explicitly confirming any of what has been discussed throughout this entire conversation. Genuine closure means trusting your own accurate understanding of the psychological patterns at play, releasing the need for their direct acknowledgement or their direct confirmation, and allowing your own healing to proceed fully based on what you now understand, rather than remaining contingent on information you may never actually receive. Let's talk about what this entire understanding ultimately reveals about the nature of avoidant withdrawal more broadly, a nature considerably more tragic than manipulative, considerably more rooted in genuine suffering than in genuine indifference. This does not excuse the impact their patterns had on your own life, your own confidence, your own well-being throughout the relationship's history. It simply offers a more complete, more accurate picture, one that allows you to release simplistic conclusions in either direction, neither believing they never cared at all, nor believing their care alone should have been sufficient to overcome patterns this deeply rooted, without genuine, dedicated internal work on their part. Let's talk about what it means to carry this understanding forward, without letting it soften your own resolve regarding what you genuinely require from any future partnership, whether this specific relationship or an entirely new one eventually proves capable of offering it. Compassion for someone's underlying fear does not mean accepting indefinitely diminished treatment while that fear remains unaddressed. It simply means holding your own boundaries with clarity rather than with bitterness, understanding fully why the pattern developed, while still refusing to let that understanding become an excuse for continuing to accept less than genuine partnership actually requires. This clarity is yours to keep, regardless of anything else that happens next. Let it settle fully, and let it carry you forward into whatever comes next with genuine, well-earned peace. You have already given this relationship considerable understanding, considerable patience, and considerable compassion. What remains now is simply the quiet, steady work of giving that same understanding, patience, and compassion back to yourself. And so, if you have maintained silence and found yourself wondering what exactly is happening on the other side of that quiet, understand that their deepest fear was never really about losing you specifically. It has always been about what your absence seems to confirm regarding a belief they have likely carried since long before you ever entered their life. A fear that they are fundamentally too difficult to love. A fear your silence, however unintentionally, activates powerfully, regardless of how genuinely they cared about you throughout this relationship's entire history. This understanding does not obligate you to fix that fear or to soften your own boundary in order to manage it. It simply offers you accurate, compassionate clarity about what is likely happening. Clarity that allows you to hold your own peace fully intact, regardless of whatever they ultimately choose to do with the fear your absence has now made impossible for them to continue avoiding.